name is Lisa Wildbacker. I'm Executive Director of Historic Hudson. And I just want to thank you so much for coming here to Jack Shaman's gallery, the school. And I hope you all had a chance to see the exhibit that's currently on view. This is an exciting two-part lecture series that we've had. I don't know how many of you were able to come to the first one that was in February at the Stair Galleries. This is part 2 of the lecture with Peter. And I'm here with Lori Yaratsky from the Columbia County Historical Society.
Hi, thank you for coming. So I want to thank also the Board of Historic Hudson and the Board of the CCHS for supporting Lisa and my collaborative idea here. Yeah, and also I want to thank our curator, Anna Thompson, over here, who worked closely with Peter to pull some artifacts that he will share with you later, and Dawn Bronson, who is our operations manager and accountant. So Peter, if you don't know Peter Watson is a preservationist and architectural historian who focuses on 19th century history and culture. He has delivered a number of public lectures in recent years on A.J. Davis and picturesque era and Shaker architecture. He's led house tours, curated exhibitions, and written blogs. He is also active in hands-on preservation and conservation work and has managed a variety of large-scale restoration, archaeology, and paint analysis projects at National Historic Landmark sites around the Hudson Valley. Peter currently serves as a board member of Historic Hudson. He's a museum trustee and chair of Historic Site Committee at the Shaker Museum, Mount Lebanon, and a rural guide for Behold New Lebanon. Before entering the preservation field, Peter spent 20 years working as management consultant to Fortune 500 firms. He holds a BA in history from Wesleyan University and an MS in historic preservation from Columbia University, GSAP, as they call it. Okay. And so there's Peter, and thank you for coming. And thank you, Jack, and your staff. Thank you for coming.
So welcome, and thank you all for coming as well today. So hopefully you were outside in this beautiful day, and now it's time to come inside and see some great architecture. And this is part 2 of our little series. So the last time we talked about A.J. Davis and the picturesque era, and a series of very interesting projects where he reinvented an existing federal period house. And really we were talking about works that were from like the 1830s to the 1860s. Today we're going to go back a little bit in time to the federal period itself and really look at buildings from the 18-teens to the 1820s. And in particular, a group of buildings that are associated formally or informally, rightly or wrongly, some might say, with a man named Barnabas Waterman, who was a master builder working in Hudson in that period. And for the architecture obsessed, and I see you out there, you know who you are. It's a lot of us shades for you. He's a very interesting and perhaps sometimes controversial figure. There's a lot of lore that's been built up around him. And so we're going to explore a little bit today as well. So I'm calling today's talk A Tale of Two Houses. And the reference point is Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, but rather than two cities or two young men on the way to the French Revolution, we're going to be talking about two incredible houses. So let's introduce them. On the right, I have the staircase of the James Vanderpoel House, dating to about circa 1820, based on the Historic Structure Report. And on the left, the staircase, the original federal period staircase, built for Samuel Plum in 1812, and that's the house that was later modified by Davis, and that's why the house is sometimes called the Bronson House as well. But today we're really going to be talking about the federal period and Samuel Plum's house. So we're very excited to be here today at the school, and I hope you both saw Winter in America, but really took a look around this building, because it's a wonderful example of contemporary historic preservation, The blend of new and old, kind of rough and smooth in it, is really terrific. And it's really added a lot of life, not only to this building, but also to the town of Kinderhook and really the region as a whole. So thank you, Jack Shaman, and thank you to Jack and Clark and Michael for all their help kind of setting this up. I'm really looking forward to it. And it's very appropriate today that we're here because the original building that we're in, the former Martin Van Buren High School, completed in 1929. It's the work of Clarence Gardner, who specialized in churches and schools. Is really just a classic example of the colonial revival period. And we're going to talk about the colonial revival period as well today, because a lot of this scholarship around Barnabas Waterman and really the initial years of the James Vanderpoel House, which at that point was called the House of History, is all part of that era, and I think you need that context to understand it. Okay. So before we begin, this is on the screen is the family night of the James Vanderpoel House. This is inside the hall, and you can see the wonderful play of light. And this is one of a lot of family nights I'm going to show you today. But before we really dig in, there's some people I'd like to thank who've been very helpful in helping me get my arms around the topic, who very generously shared their time and knowledge and images and experience. And I really want to especially thank Rod Blackburn and Ruth Pawanka, the authors of the definitive history of architecture and art in Columbia County, Visible Heritage. And they're hard at work at a new and improved version, complete in color. So we're all excited to hear more about that. Matt Kirk and Walter Wheeler I've worked with for the last 4 years on a series of investigations of the Bronson House. And we'll share a little brief synopsis of that with you at the end of the talk. George Eager has been my restoration partner for the last 15 years, and he and I spent a really interesting day getting up close and personal with the woodwork and the trim at both the Vanderpoel and Plum houses, kind of measuring, and really looking to understand whether there's a common builder's logic that links them beyond the wonderful details, just the way they're laid out and planned. Joe and, should be Gary von Bieberstein, have made a really interesting Waterman discovery, which I think you'll find fascinating. So that's something we'll talk about today. And last but not least, Anna Thompson, the curator of the Columbia County Historical Society, has really been an invaluable colleague. She's helped me navigate the archives of the Society, found rare books. Today she has some really interesting architectural fragments, and she's even climbed around the attic with me in the Vanderpoel House, so thanks to Anna as well. Okay, so I thought where I'd begin, before we kind of get into the thorny issues of attribution, is really just paint a picture, kind of give you a little bit of context for what we're talking about, what type of architecture, what kind of architectural details we're talking about when people think of our Barnabas Waterman. And I think it's important to start there because it speaks to the basic question, well, why do we care? Why do we want to talk about this person? And the reason, is just kind of taking a brief look at these examples, is that, you're looking at some really great federal period architecture. So I want to begin kind of defining things with a master example of the Vanderpoel House. And I spent a lot of time in Kinderhook over the last couple of months. And every time I see this house, I'm really struck how lovely it is. And what a wonderful balance in this composition. There's kind of the delicate but rich ornament of the door surround and the windows, contrasted with the flat planar surfaces of the brick. So it's a great composition, but let's break it down for a moment into its component parts to think about it relative to other buildings in the area. So starting from the basement, you have a raised basement of coarse Wellstone construction that's typically common to these houses. And it's raised because the kitchen is down there in the federal period, and you needed light to see what you're doing. The body of a lot of these houses is brick with marble dressings, water table, and siddles, and lintels, and arches. And that's capped typically by a balustrade, in this case in a trellis work pattern, and chimneys on the gable end, sometimes connected with a little wall called a parapet gable. Now, all of the features I've kind of ticked off so far are very common to high-style Federal period architecture really across the Northeast. There's nothing really beyond a very fine example that's that unique to our area. But what really is unique and distinctive to this region is this very particular combination of stacked families. And they're not semicircular, they're elliptical, and they're outlined with marble arches and keystones, and very exuberant leadwork. And I think people over the years, many thousands of people have visited the Vanderpoel House, and then you start going around, taking a walk, or getting in your car and looking around Columbia County, and suddenly you see bits of this house, really all around. Okay, now we want to go forward. So this is right down the street. This is on Hudson Street. It's Lawrence Van Buren's house. So that's the president's brother, and it dates to 1812. And you look at that, and it's really a very similar composition. You get the marble arch and keystone, the flattened elliptical fanlights, the leadwork. Here's another very fine example on Lower Warren Street. And here's another example across the river in Athens, New York, the Haight Van Loan House. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that because it's a part of the early scholarship on Barnabas Warren. So that's kind of a range of the exterior details. So let's take a look at some of the interior details that are common to this grouping. Again, suspending the question of authorship for the moment. Here are some details from the door head and the parlor from the hall of the Vanderpoel House and the arch. Here are the corresponding details in the Bronson House. Again, it's a very high-style example, somewhat different vocabulary. Here's yet another sort of variety of very fine, exquisite detail at the Haight Van Loan House. And you can see one common element of all these is that very distinct frieze, oval motif in the middle. And that goes back to pattern book sources. This is from Robert Adam. And this form is known as a patero, and it's defined as a shallow bowl for serving libations, okay? And fluted and with a little knob on the bottom to hold it. Now, when I look at this, okay, you're drinking wine out of a tray, okay? So how do you not spill it all over your tunic? I think that's the question I have for that one. All right. But best of all, really, are some of the most incredible staircases in Federal period America. And this image, I've been staring at it all week. Rod Blackburn sent it to me, and I look at that arch, and I think of the Gateway Arch in St. Louis of Saarinen, and I look at the way the stairs are outlined, and it almost has an Art Deco feel. So, if you can kind of look through or look past the ornament, there's a lot in these forms that I think is very modern. Here's the corresponding staircase in the Bronson House that goes a full 3 stories. And if your eyes follow that curve, it just really appears to go on forever. And sometimes I call this the Stairway from Heaven, or Stairway to Heaven, so the Led Zeppelin reference, but that's another stairway. All right, let's talk about Barnabas Waterman. These are his dates, 1776 to 1839. But what I want to tell you is the history of the history, okay? So when does he really kind of enter the scholarly record? When does Barnabas Waterman become a name? And really the first place that really made his reputation was a book published in 1942, Evelyn and Hubbard's Historic Houses of the Hudson Valley. And there's a spread of the Vanderpoel House. And they attribute 2 houses to Barnabas Waterman, architect. And it's interesting that they use the term architect, because if you look at most of the examples, they don't mention architects at all. There's a write-up for Montgomery Place, and they don't even mention H.A. Davis. Okay, so they're singling him out as an architect, they're attributing 2 houses to him, and they go on to praise him, saying, the exquisite detail of these houses bears witness to the scholarship and discriminating taste of an architect who deserves to be better known and remembered in the Hudson Valley. So that's certainly high praise. And so, okay, you have him in the 1940s, but does he appear any earlier? And I found an article from 1906 that's talking about the Gantley House, and that's the second owner of the Haight-Gantley Loan House, but no mention of Barnabas Waterman. Similarly, in 1914, in Dr. Collier's standard History of Old Kinderhook, you have a write-up about the Vanderpoel House. You even have a photo, but no mention of Barnabas Waterman. And the author says that the house is chiefly interesting for the people that live there. And it's really only in the 30s, in the bulletins of the Columbia County Historical Society, that you start seeing mentions to Barnabas Waterman and attributions of other houses, particularly some of the ones in Athens. And I've really been able to trace this down to a specific date, okay? So if anyone asks you, when did the legend of Barnabas Waterman begin, you can tell them August 5th, 1931. And this was what was called a very unique and delightful program where the historian of the society, William Wade, he was first on the program and he told the Barnabas Waterman, the architect, who built the house about 1819. So, we have a date, and that's actually closer to the date that most professionals recognize for the house of about 1819, 1820. And they call him an architect, which I think is very, very interesting. And so the big question is, William Wade, historian, who Ruth Pawaka says is a serious guy and did his homework, and I obviously trust her opinion here, what sources did he have? Did he have some original documents? Did he have letters? Did he have account books? Had he talked to some of the original owners of the houses? What really were his sources? And everyone's been trying to find out since, because they really have not been able to find the documentary sources, the kind of letters that would really make you, give you a nice firm connection. So this is a research report that's in the file. There's a whole Barnabas Waterman folder, okay? And it's full of typewritten letters of executive directors to various historical societies trying to find out where are the Waterman papers, or could you tell me about this? So for years, people have really been trying to find out more. So it's 2016, I got a lecture to prepare for in 3 weeks. What do? I go to Ancestry.com, of course, I dial them up, and from that and some of the genealogical records, I'm able to sort of piece through, a couple of facts that we know about him. Okay, so he is born in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. It's south of Boston. It's Plymouth. It's the old colony. And so that's Google Maps. This is Google Street View. So I'm driving around Bridgewater, Massachusetts, trying to find out, what kind of architecture do we have here? What are we looking at? What would he have been familiar with? What kind of things might have been he been building in his early career? Okay, let's stop here. This one looks good. And this is a very typical example of the architecture there. It's vernacular, it's frame construction. You can see it's hip-roofed, tall chimneys, and I know there's a family behind that later Greek Revival portico. So I think the point is, these are the kind of houses he's probably building, but they don't really bear much comparison to these very sophisticated, high-style examples that we associate with him. All right, but we do know by 1798, his dad had moved the family to Oakham, Mass., and that's northwest of Worcester. And he appears not to have gone with them. Instead, he got married to Sally Thatcher in 1799, and then had his first son, Charles Coatswood Pinckney Waterman, that's CCP Waterman, in 1801. So he kind of hung around Plymouth. He's now 25 years old. He has his first child. And CCP Waterman actually went on to quite an illustrious career as well. He became a partner in the famous Sandwich Glass Company. So he clearly had a head on his shoulders and maybe some of that design and engineering talent that ran in the family. Because it really is a family of house rats. His dad, his granddad, they're all builders of houses. But the question is really, what kind of houses? We do know there's a brief mention of CCP's childhood, that he makes it to Litchfield. He spent some of his childhood in Litchfield, maybe around 1801, 1804. And we know definitely that his second son, Barnabas' son, he says, is born in 1805. So now he's 29 years old, and we actually have him to Hudson. The next little bit of the historical record that we have is a record of his military service. And these are modern day War of 1812 reenactors, okay? Because everyone needs a hobby, okay? So we do know that Barnabas joined a battalion that was led by Colonel Jacob Bronson and Vanderpoel, who was a member of the Van Rensselaer family and also a major Federalist. So that tells you something about his politics. And Barnabas was promoted to captain during the War of 1812 and had his own company called the Hudson Greens. They had their own outfits, so maybe he had a little bit of a sartorial flair. We don't know. And then he becomes a major after the war, resigns his commission in 1817. Now, some people have asked, well, if he fought in the War of 1812, how could he possibly have designed and built houses that are often dated 1812, 1813, 1814? And so, a very fair question. But the thing about the War of 1812 is it was largely, around naval battles. And the only known action that he was part of was his battalion was mustered to Staten Island in 1814 in September to defend the city of New York. So probably most of the time he was on reserve status, and it's quite possible he could have attended to various jobs. Like many other men in his generation, that military service built up a key kind of web of contacts, and also was the platform by which he entered political office, become an alderman and a supervisor of Columbia County in the teens. But where are the buildings, you want to say? Okay, we know about military service. So this isn't a building that he is listed as a member of the building committee. And if you were a prominent architect, this is the kind of job you want, a big, important public building. And you can see, comparing it to those examples, I've got a fan line, I've got tall chimneys, I've got marble dressing, I've got another fan line. You're part of that look, but unfortunately, in this instance, we do know that he's not the builder. That was Ephraim Baldwin, who actually built a church in Ghent for the Lutheran Evangelical Church. We don't know much more about him. And he was also not reputed to be the designer. In fact, Robert Jenkins, the mayor and son of the proprietor, is attributed the plan, at least by the Victorian historians that I was looking at. In between that time, between this building and the next, in 1829, there's one record of a building project he actually did, and that was he was authorized to spend $2,000 by the city council to take an existing farmhouse and convert it to the county poorhouse. But so that's a job, but it's not really the kind of commission you're really looking for. One more building on this that is sometimes attributed to him is the Second Columbia County Courthouse, 1834, 1835, because there's a listing of a contractor of Birch, Waterman, and King. But thanks to Omaga and this article she sent me with a really fine engraving of the courthouse building, we know that the waterman involved was actually Joshua Toby Waterman, who was his son. Was also a carpenter, or at least listed that in the census, and also went into political office. He became mayor. Okay, so all that's really very unsatisfying, okay? I mean, the historical record is really slight. So I was really pleasantly surprised. As I was preparing for this, I was trading messages or email with Jo von Bibberstein, and she and her husband made this really interesting find when they were in the process of restoring their historic house in Flowerack, that later became Ghent, built for Jacob Moule, who had a tavern there. It was also a place where the militia mustered. And blowing that up, they found this wonderful scrolling script. It says, I hope you can read it in the back, it says, Waterman. And I got all excited. I said, this is it. This is the Holy Grail. Here, it's a signed Waterman. I thought I calmed down a little bit. It took me a little while to calm down. And then I said, well, it doesn't say Barnabas. It doesn't say B. And there actually are some other Watermans in the area. In fact, there's a carpenter called Elijah Waterman who's in the area as early as 1785. And maybe the reason that Barnabas came to Hudson in the first place for that area. And they looked at the mantle itself. And it's, a very handsome mantle, but it's not nearly as, richly ornamented with some of those other examples I showed you. But then I thought again, well, this is found in an upstairs bedroom. And if you compare it to the mantels that you find upstairs in the Plum House, for example, you know, it does sort of relate. I mean, simpler, this kind of play of rectangles, and also the back bedroom in the Vanderpoel House. So you can't rule it out entirely. You know, I think the evidence is probably a little more to another Waterman, but you know, I think we'll leave that for you to decide. And I guess the last thing I want to say about Waterman, this is another image from Blackburn. This is a house that stood at 5th and Warren, and it should be looking a little bit familiar by now. Got the gable-end chimneys, the balustrade, the family, you know, the marble sills and lintels. But what really caught my eye is on the side of the building it says Waterman's. But it actually says, use Waterman's fountain pens. Okay, so I'm going to leave the Barnabas Waterman story there. Let's do some looking at the houses themselves. And to make this tractable, I've kind of just focused on 3 things. Let's look at the fan lights, let's look at the interior trim, and let's look at the staircases and the interior planning. Just really kind of look at the houses together. What do you see? And do you see anything that really suggests a common hand in the architecture itself? Right, fan lights. So this is time for a pop quiz. This fan light should look very familiar. Can anyone tell me where you've seen it? No takers? Should look very familiar. In fact, there you go, thank you. You saw it as you came, you went right under it as you came in. The fan light in the Martin Van Buren High School, and designed by Clarence Gardner. And very, very popular for colonial revival architects to use federal details like vigilance, a big favorite of theirs. Here's a period example that shows you how they were actually built. So you had a wood frame, and then inset in that were a series of lead bars, sometimes wood, and overlaid on top of that, soldered or glued, various forms of cast lead ornament. And fan lights were very popular in federal period America, beginning in like the 1780s. And by as early as the 1790s, you really had specialists make them. So you can look through the city directories and you find fan light makers. And just as an example where we actually know something about it, this is General Hamilton at the Grange of 1802, and that's Hamilton the musical. Okay. And these are the fan lights that are designed. But what's really interesting is there's an original document. This is a letter from the builder, Ezra Weeks, to General Hamilton, just laying out the cost of the job. And what's particularly interesting is a bill from Anthony Fremont, a bill of fans and sidelights for £28. And I think this is very interesting thinking about how these buildings actually got made, okay? So you had subcontractors. And if you're a builder, you might have a preferred subcontractor that you liked their work and you had worked with, but they're going to work with other people too. So if we're thinking about fan lights as being the signature feature, you've got to be very careful about, well, is it the architect or the designer, or is it the fan light guy? The other thing that complicates the story is the designs for the fan lights themselves were taken from pattern book sources. This is Asher Benjamin's famous works that Barnabas Waterman would definitely be familiar with. And if you compare it, the fan doesn't look the same, but the side lights are very, very similar. And it really just added a little more detail, a few more pieces of ornament. But that's the basic form. Now hold that image in your mind for a moment. Let's flip to the Plum House. And you can see it's just at a glance, it's not at all the same. You have simple panes, you don't have leaded work, you have a much simpler fan, and the vocabulary of the rest of the door surround is completely different. Instead of columns, you have pilasters. Instead of capitals, you have console brackets. And the overall feel is much kind of beefier. And even if you look at the windows themselves, I mean, they're both about the same length, they're about 7 feet long, but the shapes are very different. So the takeaway from this is, if Barnabas Waterman did use a fan light maker, which we presume he did maybe in Albany, maybe in New York City, he probably used a different one on this job. Or that person changed their shop practices very significantly from 1812 to 1820. Right? so let's look at some interior trim. This is the plum door head. Very nice, here's the detail. And it's all carved, it's relief carving, it's very beautifully executed. It's very sculptural. Now turn to the Vanderpool door head, kind of the equivalent form. This is the top of the door from the hall to the parlor. And again, take a look at that patron. Very different. It's gouge carved or relief carved, and it's very graphic, in form, and it's very vibrant. But what was really interesting, and really kind of a revelation to me, is I knew from the historic structure report that at least the capitals were made out of lead. They weren't carved out of wood. But when I got up there, I really discovered that, well, that's lead, that's lead too. That really, the majority of this entire frieze is made out of metal or wood. It's not carved primarily, it's assembled. And that's very interesting because at the time, this is state-of-the-art building technology. This is the Industrial Revolution, this is standardized parts. But you have a designer who is good enough, or a specialist who made these forms, that they're creating something that is a whole. And it made me immediately think about what was happening with furniture in the same period, with Duncan Fife, who is known to have used a lot of standardized components, like in this pier table, all the brass, all the stringing, all that was imported from England. And that makes it very difficult to attribute the works because other people in town, like Lanier or Michael Allison, were using the very same mounts. And so you really have to look at, where is the designer in this, in assembling what are standardized parts into something that's still, a unified composition and a thing of beauty. I think the Fife analogy is also very interesting because you think what happened with Fife and his reputation. You went from a series of masterworks to an entire category of furniture, and basically anything that was remotely, that had any of the features of the known work, kind of got tied to the same hand. And really what you're mistaking is the hand of a master for what in fact is a regional favorite. What is New York City federal classical cabinet making? Okay, staircases. This is a little more interesting, I think. Oval or circular plant staircases, there were designs for them available before the American Revolution from English pattern book sources, but they're buried at the back of the book. And if you really look at this, you may not be able to see it that well in the back. The railing is very kind of, not very smooth, it's very kind of jumpy. But if you compare the same plate in a later version, this is the first edition in 1774, this is the fourth edition of 1789, suddenly that rendering is a lot more believable. And you see what is essentially, the mathematical fact. When you start with a circle or an oval, and you extrude it to 3 dimensions, you end up with a helix. You end up with something that's really complicated, really quickly. So when I think of soaring curves, I think of Frank Gehry. This is his Fondation Louis Vuitton in Paris that I visited a couple years ago. And obviously a building like this is all done with computers. But in the late 18th century, the early 19th century, none of that was obviously available. And this is an architect's set of tools from the 1800s. In a little nice shagreen case. You got a compass, you got another compass, you got trammel points that you put into a board. You got a protractor, something to measure some angles, a primitive slide rule, okay? That's all you got. So how do you make something that complicated with these tools? And the initial answer is you didn't, until someone figured out how. And that person was Peter Nicholson, an architect and joiner, who really made a revolutionary discovery. And I'll use his words, okay? So he's describing here how to draw any semi-ellipse upon the transverse or conjugate axis, or even a semicircle itself, by a new method of intersecting lines. And this was, a revolution, because it suddenly allowed you, with just a compass and straight edges, to create these complex forms. And you needed those complex forms to lay out the templates, and then carve them out of the solid, and you get into all of the detail that's required. So this is an example from a website, a country farmhouse, blogspot.com, and a very interesting little project, replicating a federal period staircase. But it gives you an idea of how these things were actually made. And someone who picked up on this right away was Asher Benjamin. Nicholson publishes in 1792. Asher Benjamin is bragging in 1795 that he's using it in the Hartford State House, and he includes it in his books. So the point of this is the technology is available, and at least by the first decade of the 19th century, you have the basic tools to lay it out. And he starts including circular planned staircases in his buildings for blow-up. But you can see actually, typically, and this is common to Bullfinch or Paris or any of those architects, it's buried in the back of the hall, and it's lit by either a window in the back wall or like a skylight above, and that follows English practice. But what you have at both Plum and Vanderpoel is something completely different. The staircase is in the middle of the house, and it's not lit by windows in the back wall. It's lit by the fan lights on both the first and second floors and both the front and back of the home. So it's a very different plan from that perspective. They are elliptical rather than circular, which is frankly a lot harder. The second you go from a circle to ellipse, the math's a lot harder. And the thing that really struck me is it's not just the complexity of these staircases that these two houses share. It's the whole architectural sequence, which is wonderfully planned. As you come into a vestibule, it's essentially a cubic room. It's about 12 feet high, 12 feet wide. So there's really an entry, and both houses are laid out in the same way. And that's a very Palladian kind of idea. And then there's an arch that provides a sense of arrival, and really starts to take, it's basically a rectangular volume and create a new room within it. And then by curving the sidewalls, you really get this feeling of curvature so that when you look up, your eye is really focused. And then there are little details like, the continuation of railings where you really don't need them because that's the side of the wall. And these plaster medallions of elliptical form really at the top of the ceiling. And again, this is really intended to draw your eye, to make it look really, to extend that sense of you're going on forever up this curve. So these are very carefully staged and planned tricks. I think the other thing that's interesting, you notice that the ellipse is truncated, and this is the Vanderpoel House. And the reason for that is it gave you more floor space. And the designer knew he could get away with that because you didn't see it when you had that primary view as you walked up the stairs. So there's a lot of really, kind of great thinking here that's just very sophisticated for the time. And really does look like, even if we don't know who it is, there's someone who's able to do that that's very special, and maybe by the same hand. There are also little kind of wonky details, where the room passes, the staircase passes by the rooms in a somewhat awkward manner. You can see that past the door. And clearly, I think this was because they were not the primary, you're in that primary view, so they were in a little bit in the back, and you had to locate the door in a useful way to make the room usable, not sort of jammed on the end. So this is something they share, the two houses, Plum on this side, Vanderpoel on that side. And there are also details of the staircases themselves. This is another patterning source when you paint. And you can see both the Plum and the Vanderpoel stringer brackets, very similar design. So there is some commonality with the staircase, both in the overall planning and in sort of some of the detailing that does suggest, perhaps a common hand. And I just have a few more pictures of staircases because the light was so good that day. It's a little gratuitous, but we're just going to look at them. There's one. There's another. And one final one. Okay. So now we're to the Dickensian part of the program. I promised a tale of two houses, so we need the tales, okay? And the first one I'm going to sort of tackle is the Bronson House. And this has all been created. This is a rendering of what the Plum Bronson House originally looked like in its original guise, built for Samuel Plum in 1812. And this and the images that follow really are the result of kind of multiple years of digging, archaeology, our architects, Music Cohen, Wilson Baker, and measured drawings, and really everything we know about the houses from sources like William Guy Wall's watercolor. But just kind of going through them quickly, just to show you how many layers of history you can actually get at a house. We'll take a little tour. Okay, so here's the south side of the house, and you can see there's a cistern and a very, little curved retaining wall that appears there. And this is the result of, our most recent wave of archaeological investigation. That's Matt Kirk there, kind of documenting. That's the cistern itself. We did a lot of this, a lot of very careful mapping of these features, trying to figure out what the different building campaigns were, trying to look at the stratigraphy of the site so we could figure out what's what. Now, from the last time, if you attended that lecture, that A.J. Davis came to the house in 1839 and gave it a refitting, a picturesque style, adding things like the trellis-work porches, the bracketing, the verge boards, ornamental chimney pots. And he came back again in 1849, and he created a really big addition. So the area in red there, that was all part of the 1849 edition, a tower and a two-story block that contained bedrooms on the second floor and wonderful entertaining rooms on the first floor. And we're actually going to have some concerts later in the year in those rooms, so we hope you come. But that's not where the story ends with the house, because in somewhere between 1860 and 1870, there are some additional changes. So or Folger actually designed a one-story addition. We think it was used initially as a dining room. And the other big feature that he added was this brick vault. And the current working theory is that this was actually an outdoor furnace. So you have people like A.J. Davis and other architects, some of the first attempts to create modern heating plants. And you were a little worried about them blowing up, so you wanted them a good way from the house. So that's interesting. And that change necessitated to change where the entrance was, and we think this dates to that campaign. Later owners made smaller but important changes. So this whole block, instead of being a dining room, got turned into a kitchen. And you had a little stair that was added so that you have kind of first floor access to that. But really the biggest changes were made during the period in which the house was owned by New York State. It was purchased from the McIntyres in 1950, and it was refitted to be the prison superintendent's house. And they went wild a little bit, particularly with concrete. So these are just some of the changes that happened in the state era. They glassed in the veranda. They created this patio. This still exists out there. They created this giant honking concrete ramp on the end of the vault, actually converting that into probably some kind of garage. And then they excavated under this addition. They poured a lot of concrete, which we spent a lot of time trying to get out so we could see what the heck was underneath it this season. They changed the house color. You lost a lot of the detail. And really, when you look at the house in this period, I like to think of this as prison colonial revival. Right. But the thing that's interesting is that the house, even in this period of state ownership, was really kind of intact. These are some snapshots that I found in the archives, or actually when I was creating an archive for Historic Hudson. You can see there's a Chevy Impala out front. But you can see that, the trellis work porch is still intact. And even though there are some clumsy additions, there's some bogus strap hinges on the door and some other little colonial revival little features, it's still pretty much there. Now at the time, so that's 1970. A couple of years later, the training school was closed, and the house was actually scheduled for demolition. This is 1973. And it was only by the work of J.B. Davis, the A.J. Davis scholar, who got the house on the National Register and created a campaign to save the house that was averted. Because the superintendent describes the house in this article here as an attractive hazard for youngsters and vandals. And in fact it was. This is a picture in the Vanderpoel historic structure report from 1989. It just shows you what happened. The house was boarded up, lost its porch, and really extensive damage and loss to the interior fabric. And that's really what we've been coming back from. By 2010, we got back windows and also the first phase of restoration to put a rubber roof and some flashing to seal the building envelope. And then in 2014, after a lot of documentation, a lot of debate, a lot of analysis, a little bit of hand-wringing, we took off the 1860s addition so that we could actually repair the side of the house and get back something closer to its original footprint. And last season, we kind of continued in phase 2. This is the north side of the house, so we'd be able to get the windows back where they belong and get some it properly sheathed and shingled with Alaskan cedar shingles. And at the end of the year on the other side, this is where we ended up, where the projecting bay has been substantially rebuilt, and we're hoping this coming season to finish up the remaining work, which really involves this bay and some of this area here, with your help. So please support Historic Hudson. There's my little plug. Okay. So let's turn to the Vanderpoel House, which has quite a different history, and one that really speaks to our colonial revival theme. I think it's very interesting. Now, as many of you know, the James Vanderpoel House, as it's known today, was first known as the House of History. And so we're going to talk about that. This is the earliest known photo of the house. It dates to about 1865, and it is really a key document. This is during the Burt residence, and actually Anna has at least an original version of the photo there that you can take a look at later. Now there are a couple of things that are very interesting in this view that I hope you can see. I'll try to pick out. The first is there's this great fence. Okay, so there are the posts, and that looks like yet another form that might have had a pattern book source from Usher Benjamin. But what really kind of caught my eye and jumped right out at me is this pair of outbuildings. Okay, they're board and batten, they have tall pointed gables. And if you had gone to the last lecture where we talked about the picturesque, you'd recognize them, they're right out of the Davis County playbook. So you really have, and here's a plate from Downing in 1849, Country House book. And you can see there's a very similar design. And so I think this is really kind of a fascinating document because you have this layering of updating the house. It's still a classical core, but now it has these little picturesque pendants. So it's just interesting how things change with the tale of this house. Okay, now some changes were probably less fortunate. This is also, you could say, a descendant of some of those trellis work verandas I showed you last time, of a later generation. This probably was added to the house sometime in the 1870s or 80s. And this is the form that the house was first purchased by the Columbia County Historical Society in 1925. And for those of you who have restored an old house, like I have, I know a number of them in the rooms, this is the before photo. The porch is kind of falling off, it's lost the balustrade. And I'm very concerned about this tree right here. It just looks like it's, with the storms we have right now, it's just going to take out the house. So this is the marker out front from a couple of days ago when it was raining. And you can see, one, there's a different date, 1810. I would say, in general, about 60 to 70% of New York State markers have the wrong date on them, particularly if they're done in the 40s or 50s. But what's really interesting about this is this name, the House of History, existed long before the house was actually purchased. And this is something I didn't know. And it's actually Judge Caddy of Hudson who coined the term. And he described, this is in 1919, he called for a roofed and sheltering house of history dedicated to the memory of valor, virtue, and wisdom of our dead, and serving as an incentive to the patriotic love of country. So this is a very different kind of house of history than I thought it was. I mean, this is a war monument. This is like Carson being appointed to the village committee to create a memorial for war dead in Downton, okay? So it's a very different idea, and it does speak to, even in the colonial revival period, how, even if it's a general umbrella, there are really different periods and different goals. So kind of an initial goal that was about memorizing the dead, and that very much changed later on. So the first wave of restoration was in the years from the mid-20s to the late 30s. This is a view from 1929. You can see that outbuilding is still extant in this period, although soon thereafter, someone offered me like $100 and they carted it away. So that was lost, unfortunately. And you can see the porch has been removed, and it has the white shutters in this period. Now, one of the really interesting people who was involved in this era in about 1930 was Bronson and Vanderpoel. And it really speaks to the stature of this project that they were able to get him to come up and advise on the project. Because, he was a big league architect in this period. He had designed beyond many country houses for the Gilded Age millionaires. He had been involved with the restoration of City Hall. He created Forest Hills Gardens. So he was very accomplished. Although when I look at this image, I was like, what is going on with that mustache? It's really, I don't know what's happening there. But I think, the reason that they hired him and the reason why it was important that he was involved is Bronson and Vanderpoel was also the architect of the American Wing. And this is his competition drawing for the overall plan. The building set in a garden, and on the other side was the Wentworth building from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that was never moved. And again, back to our last year, this building should look familiar because, of course, it's by Martin Thompson, it's the Second Branch Bank, and here it is rendered by A.J. Davis. So I've made at least a couple of connections between the two lectures. But really, the reason it's important for our story is the American Wing really popularized the whole idea of period room and the whole idea of having this very particular setting for furniture of the period. This is a view in the heyday of the House of History, in the James Vanderpoel House, as we call it today, in one of the parlors. And you can see it's very much in this aesthetic. And in that period, this had kind of an educational goal. It's interesting, Bronson and Vanderpoel talking about the American Wing. He's expressing, and these are his words, of why he thought it was important to do that. He said, our sense of beauty is like a magnetic compass. It does not always point true north. Someday, we may have a gyroscopic sense of beauty, but until that time, an exhibition of colonial art may furnish a very healthy corrective if we heed its teachings. So these were very much about creating a very particular kind of environment. Not so much about the family who lived there, but very much about a display, an exhibition of colonial art in a room setting. And I think this was very influential to the creators of the House of History. And in particular, this fellow on the screen here, James Edward Leith, the second president of the society. And while he was president from the 30s on, he's actually there, Anna and I figured out, as early as November of 1930. So he's there really during the time period where a lot of these choices got made. And he's also, if you read his letters, some of them are something. So, I think he was a very difficult person. But you really have to give him credit for creating this organization, for getting the restoration done in the height of the Depression. And he's a really modern figure in that respect, kind of anticipates what a modern executive director does today, and that is marketing. And this is a pamphlet that was published first in the 30s, really throughout the 30s, and it has his handprints all over it. And I just want to read you a little section because it's very telling in terms of what he's trying to accomplish. And he describes it as the tale, as told by the old house itself in a voice, faint at first, gaining strength with maturity, melding at last into the completeness of age, depicts the cycle of life as it flowed in around this old house in a stream, at once quiet. And he describes also the fragrant paths of memory. It goes on and on like that. So it's very romantic, it's very evocative. And this is not history as a bomb, this is kind of history as a narcotic. And you have to really think about it. In the Depression, you really needed that. And so I think creating this very special place where you could see these, beautiful, what they call colonial, call it federal period, furniture, in this special setting, it really played an important role for me. Now, all of that really was seen as very old hat by the time in the 80s. It really is just the changing of time. So in the 30s and 40s and 50s, where the colonial revival was really going strong, there was a lot of this emphasis on the romantic view of history. That by the time Lisa Cohen Wade architects were writing the Historic Structure Report in 1989, and I've worked with the firm, they're all very smart, accomplished people, but like all good preservation architects, they're something of a scold. And they tell us, as the name House of History indicates, the emphasis seems to have been on romantic remodeling of the house as a generic regional building type, rather than the accurate restoration of the house of historic form based on the original ownership. And it goes on a bit in that vein. And you can see there's really kind of a changing of what the house was designed to be. Is the house primarily a house of history to memorialize the war dead? Is it a house of history to display highlights of colonial art, kind of a didactic focus? Or is it meant to be something, an authentic interior of the period? And really, at a certain level, you can say those are all reasonable kind of goals to accomplish. You don't necessarily have to privilege one versus another, but they're very different, and you make very different choices when those are your goals. And there were clearly some changes that were made over the years that did increase the accuracy of the restoration itself. And one, for example, this is back to that 1865 photo, was the treatment of the balustrade. And what the architects pointed out on the right way, you can almost see it in this picture, is that instead of diving into the roof like your average balustrade, it actually went over the top. And so that's the form in which it exists now. And this is the James Vanderpoel House sitting very quietly and elegantly in the March sunshine. And it's ready for its next 100 years. 100 years of deciding. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it today. I'm glad to take some questions, and thank you all for listening. Glad to take some questions, and thank you all for listening.